Dinner at Mrs. Walker's house was unlike anything Jason had experienced in a long time. Her home smelled of roasted meat, buttered vegetables, and warm bread fresh from the oven. Jason couldn't remember the last time he had such a well-cooked, homemade meal. Emily's eyes lit up as she took in the spread on the dining table: golden brown roast beef, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, and a basket of warm rolls. "You really didn't have to do all this, Mrs. Walker," Jason said as he helped Emily into a chair. "Nonsense," she replied with a gentle smile. "You did me a great kindness today, and this is the least I can do in return. Besides, I love having company." Jason understood that feeling all too well. Since his wife had passed away 3 years ago, it had been just him and Emily. And while he loved his daughter more than anything, the loneliness had settled in his bones like an old ache. Something about sitting at Mrs. Walker's table, with the warmth of a home-cooked meal and the sound of quiet conversation, made him realize just how much he missed moments like these. As they ate, Emily chatted happily with Mrs. Walker, telling her all about her favorite books and how she wanted to be a teacher when she grew up. Mrs. Walker listened with genuine interest, nodding and asking questions that made Emily feel important. Jason watched them, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Jason," Mrs. Walker said after a while, turning her gaze to him. "How's work been treating you?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's been slow. I pick up jobs where I can, but it's been tough lately." She nodded, as if she already knew. "You're a hard worker," she said. "I could see that today. Not many people would take the time to fix an old woman's fence just to be kind." Jason shrugged. "You've been good to me and Emily. It was the least I could do." Mrs. Walker looked thoughtful as she buttered a roll. "You know, my late husband ran a construction company. He always used to say that a man who works with his hands and his heart will never be without purpose." Jason thought about that for a moment. He had always enjoyed working with his hands. There was something satisfying about taking something broken and making it whole again. "You ever think about doing more steady work in carpentry?" she asked. Jason sighed. "I'd love to, but I don't have the right connections. Most of the steady jobs go to people who have been in the business longer." Mrs. Walker gave him a knowing smile. "Sometimes, the right opportunities come when we least expect them." They spent the rest of the evening talking, sharing stories, and enjoying each other's company. By the time Jason and Emily left, the sky was dark, and the air had cooled. "Thank you for dinner," Jason said as he stood on the porch, Emily holding onto his hand sleepily. Mrs. Walker patted his arm. "Thank you for the fence. And Jason, if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." He nodded, though he wasn't the type to ask for help. "Good night, Mrs. Walker." "Good night, dear." As Jason carried Emily back to their house, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about today had shifted. He didn't know what it was yet, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely alone. The next morning, Jason woke up early and got to work on the small repair jobs he had lined up for the day. He spent the morning fixing a leaky pipe for an elderly man across town, then patched up a broken step for a woman who had slipped on it the week before. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough to buy groceries for the next couple of days. As he was loading his tools back into his truck, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out and frowned at the unfamiliar number. "Hello? Is this Jason Carter?" a deep voice asked. "Yeah. Who's this?" "My name's Richard Lawson. I own a small contracting business in town. I got your number from Evelyn Walker." Jason's eyebrows shot up. "Mrs. Walker?" "That's right. She told me you did some work on her fence. Said you did a fine job and that you're a hard worker." Jason wasn't sure what to say. Yeah, I fixed it up for her." "Well, I've been looking for an extra hand on a few projects," Richard said. "It's nothing fancy, but it's steady work. Pays fair. If you're interested, I'd like to meet and talk about it." Jason's heart pounded. Steady work. The kind of job he had been hoping for. "When would you like to meet?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Tomorrow morning, if you're free. My office is on Maple Street, just past the hardware store. I'll be there, Jason said quickly. Good. See you then. As he hung up the phone, Jason exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Mrs. Walker had done this for him. She had seen his work, seen his struggle, and without him even asking, she had reached out to someone who could help. He looked over at Emily, who was playing with a small doll on the porch steps. He thought about the way she had smiled at Mrs. Walker's dinner table, the way she had laughed without worry. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to turn around. The next morning, Jason woke up earlier than usual, his mind already racing. The opportunity Richard Lawson had offered was exactly what he needed: steady work, fair pay, and a chance to build something long-term. He hadn't even met the man yet, but the fact that Mrs. Walker had spoken so highly of him was enough to make Jason hopeful. He moved quietly through the house, not wanting to wake Emily, as he made a pot of coffee. His hands were steady, but his chest felt tight. It had been a long time since he'd had anything close to a real job interview. Most of his work came from word of mouth and odd jobs, none of which required him to sit across from a business owner and prove himself. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. He could do this. By the time Emily woke up, Jason had already dressed in his cleanest work jeans and a button-up shirt. He helped her get ready for the day, making sure she had breakfast before dropping her off at a neighbor's house for a few hours. When he arrived at Richard Lawson's office, he took a moment to steady himself before stepping inside. The place was small but well kept, with a few framed blueprints on the walls and a large wooden desk in the center. Behind it sat a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, his graying hair neatly combed back. Richard stood as Jason entered, extending a hand. "You must be Jason Carter." Jason shook his hand firmly. "Yes, sir. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me." Richard motioned for him to sit. "Evelyn Walker speaks highly of you. Says you did good work on her fence." Jason nodded. "She's a kind woman. I was happy to help." Richard studied him for a moment before leaning back in his chair. "Tell me about your experience. What kind of work have you done?" Jason took a breath and explained his background, not just the odd jobs, but the years he had spent doing construction before Emily was born. He talked about the projects he had worked on, the skills he had picked up, and the kind of work he enjoyed most. Richard listened carefully, nodding every now and then. When Jason finished, there was a brief silence. "You've got a good work ethic," Richard finally said. "And I can tell you take pride in what you do." Jason sat up a little straighter. "Yes, sir, I do." Richard tapped his fingers against the desk. "I won't lie to you, Jason. Times are tough. But I could use a man like you. Someone reliable." Jason's heart pounded. "I'm willing," he said. Richard nodded. "Good. Be at the job site tomorrow morning at 7. The next morning, Jason arrived at the job site before sunrise. The renovation project was an older house that needed serious work: new flooring, drywall repairs, and a fresh coat of paint. Richard introduced him to the crew, a mix of men who had been with the company for years and a few younger guys just starting out. At first, Jason kept his head down, focusing on the work. He wanted to prove himself. He measured twice before cutting, double-checked his work, and made sure to ask questions when needed. By midday, Richard gave him an approving nod. "You work fast and clean," he said. "That's good. Keep it up." Jason nodded, his confidence growing. But just as things were starting to go smoothly, a problem arose. One of the younger workers, a man named Tyler, had been struggling with a section of drywall. Jason noticed him frowning as he tried to align the panels, but something wasn't right. The measurements were off by just enough to cause a headache later. Jason hesitated. It wasn't his place to correct someone else's work, but he also knew that leaving it as it was would create problems down the line. Finally, he stepped forward. "Hey, Tyler." The younger man looked up, his expression wary. "Yeah? I think your measurements might be a little off. Mind if I take a look?" Tyler bristled at first, but then sighed and handed Jason the measuring tape. Jason quickly checked the numbers, then showed Tyler where the mistake was. I did the same thing my first time, Jason admitted with a small smile. It's an easy fix. Tyler exhaled and nodded. Thanks, man. I appreciate it. By the end of the day, Jason felt good. He had worked hard, proven himself, and even helped a co-worker. When Richard handed him his first paycheck at the end of the week, Jason felt something he hadn't in a long time: stability. That weekend, he and Emily went grocery shopping without having to count every dollar. He made a full breakfast for the first time in weeks, eggs and bacon sizzling on the stove as Emily happily set the table. But the best moment came a few days later when Mrs. Walker stopped by with a small package. Jason opened it to find a set of brand new work gloves and a note. Jason, hard work deserves appreciation. I'm proud of you. Evelyn. Jason smiled, gripping the gloves. For the first time in a long while, he felt like things were finally falling into place. The following weeks settled into a rhythm Jason hadn't known in years. Every morning, he woke up before dawn, packed his lunch, and kissed Emily on the forehead before heading off to work. The long hours of labor left his muscles sore, but it was a satisfying kind of exhaustion. At the end of each week, he received a paycheck that made it possible to keep the lights on, put food on the table, and even set a little aside for emergencies. Emily noticed the change almost immediately. You're smiling more, Daddy, she said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Jason chuckled softly. Yeah. Guess I have more reasons to now. She leaned her head against his arm, her small fingers tracing patterns on his sleeve. I like it when you're happy. Jason swallowed the lump in his throat and kissed the top of her head. Me too, sweetheart. At work, Jason quickly became someone the crew relied on. His experience showed in the way he handled tasks efficiently, and his willingness to help others earned him the respect of his co-workers. Even Tyler, the younger worker he had helped on his first day, had warmed up to him, often seeking his advice when a task felt overwhelming. One afternoon, Richard pulled Jason aside as they loaded lumber onto a truck. You've been doing good work, Richard said, crossing his arms. Steady. Reliable. That's hard to come by these days. Jason wiped the sweat from his forehead. I appreciate that. Richard studied him for a moment. You ever think about taking on more responsibility? Maybe a lead position? Jason blinked. A lead? Richard nodded. Nothing official yet. But I need someone who can oversee smaller projects, make sure things run smoothly. You've got the experience for it. Jason hesitated. It was an opportunity, one that could mean more stability for him and Emily. But doubt crept in. Was he ready for that kind of responsibility? Richard seemed to sense his hesitation. Think about it, he said. No rush. But if you're interested, I'd like to talk more about it soon. Jason nodded slowly. I will. Thank you. As he drove home that evening, his mind raced. A lead position meant more money, more security for Emily. But it also meant more pressure. Could he handle it? That night, as he helped Emily with her homework at the kitchen table, she looked up at him with a serious expression. Daddy, what's wrong? Jason smiled, shaking his head. Nothing, sweetheart. Just thinking. Emily tilted her head. About work? Yeah. She tapped her pencil against the table. Do you like your job? Jason nodded. I do. Then you should do whatever makes you happiest, she said simply. Jason stared at her. Sometimes, his daughter had a way of making complicated things seem so simple. The next day, he told Richard he was interested in the lead position. Good, Richard said with a grin. I had a feeling you'd come around. With the new role came new challenges, managing schedules, making sure everyone had the right materials, and keeping projects on track. There were days when Jason felt overwhelmed. But every time he doubted himself, he reminded himself why he was doing it. For Emily. For their future. One evening, just as Jason was finishing up paperwork at the job site, his phone rang. He frowned at the unknown number before answering. "Hello? Is this Jason Carter?" a familiar voice asked. Jason recognized it immediately. "Mrs. Walker?" "Yes, dear. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all. Is everything okay?" There was a brief pause. "I was wondering if you could stop by tomorrow. There's something I'd like to talk to you about." Jason's brow furrowed. "Of course. I'll be by in the morning." The next day, after dropping Emily off at school, Jason made his way to Mrs. Walker's house. She greeted him at the door with her usual warm smile and invited him inside. "I won't keep you long," she said as she led him to the kitchen. "I just wanted to thank you properly." Jason frowned. "Thank me?" Mrs. Walker nodded as she set a small envelope on the table between them. "For helping me with my fence that day. And for being the kind of man who would do something kind without expecting anything in return." Jason hesitated before picking up the envelope. Inside was a check. His eyes widened as he saw the amount $5,000. "Mrs. Walker, I can't accept this," he said immediately, shaking his head. She reached out and placed a gentle hand over his. "Yes, you can. And you will." Jason swallowed hard. "Why?" Mrs. Walker smiled softly. "Because people like you deserve a little kindness in return. And because I know what it's like to struggle." Jason looked down at the check, his heart pounding. This money could change so much. It could help him catch up on bills, put something aside for Emily's future. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. Mrs. Walker squeezed his hand. "Just promise me one thing. Anything." She smiled. "When the time comes, pay it forward." Jason nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I will." Over the next few months, Jason's life slowly transformed. The steady work, the leadership role, and the unexpected financial help from Mrs. Walker had given him and Emily a stability they hadn't known in years. He was able to pay off the overdue bills, replace the worn-out tires on his truck, and even start setting aside a small savings fund. Not just for emergencies, but for the future. More than anything, though, Jason noticed the change in himself. He no longer woke up dreading the day ahead. He stood taller, more confident in his abilities. And Emily, she seemed lighter, happier, as if she could sense that the weight her father had been carrying for so long was finally lifting. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold, Emily turned to Jason with a thoughtful expression. "Daddy?" "Yeah, sweetheart? Do you think we could get a house one day? A real one, just for us?" Jason's heart clenched at the question. Their rental house was small, worn down in places, but it had been their home. Still, the idea of owning something of their own, a place where Emily could grow up without the fear of having to move, was something he had dreamed about too. He took a deep breath. "I think we can," he said, his voice steady. "Maybe not right away, but one day." Emily smiled and nodded, as if she had never doubted it. As the weeks passed, Jason continued to work hard, proving himself in his new leadership role. Richard took notice, gradually trusting him with more responsibilities. One day, after they had finished a particularly tough renovation project, Richard pulled Jason aside. "You've done good work," he said, crossing his arms. "Better than good." Jason wiped the sweat from his brow. "I appreciate that, Richard." The older man nodded. "I've been thinking about expanding the business, taking on more projects. I need someone I can trust to help manage it." Jason frowned slightly. "You mean?" Richard nodded. "I mean, I want to make you my foreman." Jason blinked. "Foreman?" "It'll come with a raise, more responsibilities, but also more stability." Jason exhaled slowly, absorbing the offer. A year ago, he never would have imagined this moment. He had started with nothing. No steady job, no savings, just a deep love for his daughter and a willingness to work hard. And now, He was being offered a real future. He looked Richard in the eye and nodded. "I'd be honored." Richard grinned and clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. I'll get the paperwork sorted out." That evening, Jason picked up Emily from school and took her out for ice cream, a rare treat. As they sat together in the small shop, Emily swinging her feet happily, Jason watched her with a full heart. "Guess what?" he said, tapping his spoon against the table. Emily looked up, curious. "What?" "I got a promotion today." Her face lit up. "Really?" Jason nodded. "It means things are going to be even better for us. We're getting closer to that house you were talking about." Emily grinned and held up her spoon. "Then we have to celebrate." Jason laughed, clinking his spoon against hers. "I think we already are." As they walked home that evening, Jason felt something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. He knew there would still be challenges ahead. But for the first time, he felt ready to face them. A few days later, Jason stopped by Mrs. Walker's house, a bouquet of fresh flowers in hand. When she opened the door, she smiled warmly. "Well, this is a surprise," she said, stepping aside to let him in. Jason handed her the flowers. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." Mrs. Walker accepted them with a knowing smile. "You've done well for yourself, Jason." He nodded. "I had help. And I won't forget it." She set the flowers in a vase, her movements slow but steady. "Have you thought about how you'll pay it forward?" Jason nodded. "I have. And I will." Mrs. Walker smiled. "I don't doubt it." As Jason left her house that evening, he thought about how much had changed since the day he fixed her fence. He had come into her life thinking he was helping her. But in truth, she had helped him just as much. And one day, when the opportunity came, he would do the same for someone else.